Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Morton Blackwell. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times. I always try to look at the newspapers before these breakfasts and think of what to comment on. And this morning my comment is simple, which is I'm so glad that the metropolitan area does not have only one daily newspaper. I have here in my hands the Washington Post and the Washington Times. The headline in the Washington Post is, "No Signs Islamic State Led Texas Plot." The Washington Times headline says, "Jeb Bush hits rough patch in outreach to evangelicals. Can't name genuine conservatives on team." I encourage you all to live tweet today's event. The hashtag is WWCB. In 2015, the Leadership Institute has already trained 2,549 students nationally and 204 students internationally in 44 trainings representing 20 of our 44 different types of training schools. Thank you. And since 1979, the Institute has trained 164,021 students. You have before you two upcoming Leadership Institute trainings. One of the flyers is for my new effective legislative hearing training. This is something I have wanted to do for a very long time. I'm not entirely happy with the perfectly descriptive term effective legislative hearing training. My working title was Vocational Training for the Hearing Impaired. This new training will help Capitol Hill staff and conservative activists maximize results during the entire hearing process from start to finish. And this new training presented for the first time on Wednesday, May 7th and Thursday, May 28th. It's in the evenings of both days, and I encourage any of you interested to register and attend, and particularly bring this attention to the attention of members of Congress and conservative staff. It would be, I think, highly, I intend it to be highly useful, and I'm looking forward to it. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Christine Ayuto, who will give our invocation and lead the Pledge of Allegiance this morning. She is a grassroots activist school coordinator here at the Institute. She travels to the United States conducting political training workshops to prepare the next generation of grassroots conservative leaders. She is a graduate of the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Christina?
Good morning. How's everyone doing today? Who's excited to be a conservative? All right, great. All of us in this room, hopefully. So at our last breakfast, I offered a prayer from President George Washington and received so much positive encouragement, I decided to offer another historical prayer. And this one was given back in 1774. It was the first prayer of the First Continental Congress, offered by Reverend Jacob Dutch. Let us bow our heads in prayer. O Lord, our Heavenly Father, high and mighty King of kings and Lord of lords, who from thy throne behold all the dwellers on earth, and reigns with power supreme and uncontrolled over all the kingdoms, empires, and governments. Look down in mercy, we beseech thee, on these our American states, who have fled to you from the rod of the oppressor and thrown themselves on thy gracious protection, desiring to be henceforth dependent only on you. To thee have they appealed for the righteousness of their cause. To thee we now look up for the countenance and support which you alone can give. Take us, therefore, Heavenly Father, under your nurturing care. Give us wisdom in counsel and valor in the field. Defeat the malicious designs of our cruel adversaries. Convince them of the unrighteousness of their cause. Be thou present, O God of wisdom, and direct the counsels of this honorable assembly. Enable them to settle things on the best and surest foundation, that order, harmony, and peace may be effectually restored, and truth and justice, religion prevail and flourish among the people. Preserve the health of our bodies, the vigor of our minds. Shower down on our representatives and the millions they represent such blessings as you see useful for them in this world, and crown them with everlasting glory in the world to come. All this we ask in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. We can stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Christina. We're happy to have you back again to deliver the prayer. We had other alternatives, of course, but we know that the prayer of the wicked availeth nothing. Aaron Reese is now going to provide us with a brief update on the major renovations in the Institute's multimedia studios. Aaron is the director of the Leadership Institute studios. He is responsible for directing live television shoots and editing videos that the Leadership Institute and other conservative organizations produce. And I encourage you afterwards to take the tour and look at what we have now done in our spectacularly redone studios, which are directly above us. Aaron graduated from the Illinois School of Art and Design with the BFA in photography. Aaron?
Morning. You know, one of the nice things about working upstairs in our Leadership Institute studios is we get to work with all the different departments. So we work with the programs department at Leadership Institute with a lot of their events, as well as a lot of the schools that go on here. We work with Campus Reform, helping them create videos from time to time. And we also get to work with a lot of different organizations all over town. So a lot of conservative videos that you see on YouTube. There's a surprising number that we get to shoot upstairs, and we don't edit them all here, but a lot of the times we do edit them. Sometimes we just record and provide the content for it. It's really great. I'm so thankful to all the donors, the Leadership Institute, that allowed us to go through recently with the renovation upstairs. I'm just so grateful that all the donors, you know, saw a real need for this, and I encourage everybody afterward to go upstairs and take a look at the tour. You know, check out the new studio classroom that we've got here. And I really appreciate you all being here this morning. So I'll be upstairs about right after this as well, and I'll help you guys check it out if you'd like to see it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Chris really does a great job for us in our studios. And now to introduce our outstanding speaker, who is an old friend of mine. I don't know how old he is, but he's an old friend. To introduce him, we have Chris Doss, Deputy Director for Grassroots here at the Institute. Chris's political work has taken him across the U.S. and to nearly 20 countries, where he's met and worked with heads of state and members of Parliament. Chris?
Thank you. I appreciate being introduced by my old friend, Morton Blackwell. This is one occasion in which that trite old expression works. For this audience and this speaker, he needs no introduction. But I want to share with you a story from the days of Ronald Reagan and the Cold War to give you some sense of the gravity of his work in the United States. And for those of you who may not be so familiar, we have a few Canucks and other aliens in the audience. And let me assure all of you, whether you're here legally or not, that we have a regime that won't send you home no matter what. The work that is being done is a reflection of the times that have arrived in this country. Going back to the Reagan era, the Cold War. In the Soviet Union, the news service, the equivalent of Reuters and the Associated Press, was called Vremya, the Russian word for truth. The major newspaper was called Pravda, the Russian word for news. No, I have that backwards. Pravda is the word for truth. Vremya is the word for news.
Vremya is the word for
Time. But the Soviet citizens had an expression, and they always said, there's no truth in Pravda, and there's no news in Vremya. We live in a time when there's no education in our education system. There's no public service in our class of public servants. And there's no news in our class, in our estate, that is supposed to provide us news. And I know there are many of you who enjoy the clear documentation we get from Brent Bozell on television and when we read what he does. Where would we be without this kind of work? I am awed and honored to present to you Brent Bozell.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. The first thing I want to say is that if my voice falls apart and I fall apart, it's because of this blasted pollen out there. I've never had allergies, and I've always felt sorry for people who did. We are now at that old stage in our lives where we feel sorry for ourselves. So I'm there. Now, before I start, I want to say something about Morton Blackwell, and I've said this a number of times before to Leadership Institute folks. I don't know if I've said it in front of Morton before, so let me say it now. If you want to know the value of what Morton has done for the conservative movement, I want you to listen to this story. Hear all the wonderful things that Chris just said about me, and they're not true, but they're wonderful sounding. But assuming they were true, in 1979, I came to Washington, D.C. from college. I was married, 2 children, nothing. I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just wanted to get involved in the Reagan Revolution that was emerging. Somebody told me to talk to this fellow, Morton Blackwell. Morton was then working for Senator Gordon Humphreys. I called him thinking that's somewhat of an imposition, but he said, come over to the Senate and let's talk. And we went down to the cafeteria. Morton spent over 3 hours with me, asking me questions, talking about the movement, and giving me names to contact. The top of his list was Terry Dolan and the National Conservative Political Action Committee. The next day, I called Terry Dolan. He took the call. He told me he had a school coming up the following week. I enrolled in that school, and a week later, he hired me. So, you want to give me credit, Morton? I'll give you some credit, too. All right. Last week, or earlier this week, I was doing a TV show with somebody talking about the media and their coverage of things. And this person, I'm not going to name the name, but this person I was on with said something that I just had to, unfortunately, call her out on and tell her that she spoke nonsense. She suggested that the media are doing a thorough job in covering Hillary Clinton and the scandals. I asked her to name me a single scandal. There's an alphabet soup of scandals involving Bill and Hillary Clinton. To name me a single scandal that's ever been resolved in the media. A single one. A single scandal involving Barack Obama that's ever been solved by the media, that's ever been fully investigated by the media. You can't do it. It doesn't exist. So when you hear people talk about this, what they are doing is promoting a position that conservatives don't have anything to talk about. And what I want to talk to you about today is something that is emerging that is far more frightening than the media bias that we have known historically. There are two forms of bias. There's the bias by commission, where they directly try to slant a story. And then there's the bias by omission, where they don't report a story. I can talk about all the stories that the press has deliberately, I want to underline, deliberately chosen not to report in the past several years. But I'm not going to do that. What I want to talk about is something deeper than that, something that we've seen emerging, that the bits and pieces of it are known to everyone, but we haven't been connecting the dots, and we need to connect the dots. It is the media's assault on free speech, and it's the cultural left's assault on free speech, unlike anything we've seen before. Last summer, there was a piece of legislation that was introduced in a Senate subcommittee, SJR 19. It passed everyone by because of other things in the news. This was a proposal by the Democrats, I'm not kidding you, to amend the First Amendment and to suggest that in the last days of the campaign that there needed to be more of a congressional oversight over political activities in the media. Ted Cruz confronted the Democrats. He asked them, does that mean that you would control movies? What about Dinesh D'Souza and his movie? Doesn't this mean you would control TV series? Madam Secretary, it's patterned on Hillary Clinton. What about books? What about political columnists? What about newspapers? What about bumper stickers? What about flyers? What about anything that communicates? Would not the Congress have control over speech in the waning days of the election? Well, they couldn't answer him. They just said, no, it's not true. But it was true, of course. So he offered a counter amendment. He offered the First Amendment. Every single Democrat on the committee voted against it. What's going on here? The left, the cultural left, is in an all-out mode to control speech in this country. Think about these things. Think about things that you're hearing in bits and pieces. What was the IRS scandal all about? It was a blatant attempt by the government, using the most feared arm of the government, to stifle, to harass, to persecute, to prosecute people for exercising their free speech as conservatives. How serious were they about this? They were so serious that we now know they were coordinating with the Department of Justice that was supposed to be investigating them. That, folks, by the way, is illegal. They were sharing taxpayer information with the Federal Election Commission, which is illegal. Speaking of illegalities, they were committing perjury on Capitol Hill, lying at the White House, destroying public property. Think about Watergate. Think about, for those of you who were around in the days of Watergate, think about what the crime was then, which forced an American president to resign. It was a paper cut compared to the IRS scandal. The IRS is not the only entity that's going after free speech. The FCC. In 1993, they reintroduced the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine sounds so good. It just gives everybody a voice on radio. Now, who's against that? That's not what the Fairness Doctrine is about. The Fairness Doctrine says you have to give an equal voice to both sides. Now, what's happened with liberal talk radio? Whether it's Jim Hightower, whether it's Jesse Jackson, whether it's Mario Cuomo, whether it's Doug Wilder, they've all been given national TV radio shows. Every single one of them has bombed. There's this wonderful thing called the free market. People don't want to listen to them. And so they've gone out of business. The Fairness Doctrine would say, well, if you want to have Rush Limbaugh, you've got to give equal time to one of these people. And what's the station manager going to do? He's going to say, I'm going to lose my shirt on this. I have only one alternative. We're going to country music. And that's the end of Rush Limbaugh. And they knew you get rid of Rush, you get rid of everybody else. That's just the beginning of it. That was stopped. What did they come with next? Last summer again, very quietly. And you have to watch these things from the federal government. Very quietly, there was an effort that was about to be undertaken where the FCC was going to put a monitor in every newsroom in America to make sure that the news was being reported properly. You mentioned Pravda. What's the difference? That's exactly what the federal government, through the FCC, was intending to do. It was a Republican member of the FCC, a Republican commissioner, who blew the whistle on this sub rosa effort by the FCC. Now net neutrality. They've taken over the internet. Now they say, well, they haven't. They have. Of course they have. Whoever controls a highway controls who goes on it, controls how fast you go, controls when you go, and they now control it, which is the future of communications in America. And it's not just the FCC. How many people know that the FEC came right behind the FCC and has now declared that, well, since the government now has the power to regulate the airwaves, the internet, shouldn't the FEC have the power to control political free speech at the end of an election cycle, right back to where they were at the beginning? And of course, everybody has said, well, that's nonsense, nonsense. Folks, everything that the left has accomplished started off as nonsense, and they ultimately got it. That's where the FCC is trying to get. If the cultural left cannot succeed through government programs, mark my words, there is a campaign underway of character assassination to destroy anybody who speaks up against their positions. Brendan Ike, the founder of Mozilla, hugely successful corporation, he gave a $1,000 contribution to support the marriage amendment in California in 2008, which, by the way, passed. For that $1,000 contribution, he was so endlessly harassed by the radical left, calling him a homophobe and a hater and everything else. And then they went after Mozilla, accusing Mozilla of enabling homophobia, hatred, and everything else. To save his own company, he had to resign from it. And the man no longer is associated with the company he founded. Dan Cathy, Chick-fil-A. They tried to do the exact same thing with him. This time, the evangelicals were behind him. And this time, the evangelicals stopped him. But it was the same idea. You support Christian values, we will destroy you for it. How many people know what happened to Alec? Alec was involved in the Stand Your Ground legislation. And then Trayvon Martin was killed. Immediately, these cultural radicals saw their opportunity. They went after the corporate supporters of Alec. And they said, you are complicit in murder. This man was murdered, and it was this policy that you underwrote with your contributions that resulted in that. And what happened? Immediately, Kraft's, McDonald's, Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, they all headed for the tall grass and cut off support of Alec, which is exactly what the cultural radicals wanted. They're going after Rush Limbaugh personally now. They first started it with the Phony Soldier campaign. The Phony Soldier campaign, I was intimately involved with this. If ever there was a phony campaign, it was this. They accused him of calling phony soldiers who had served in Iraq and were against the war. Now, if you read the transcript or listen to it, it's there for anyone to read or listen to. He never said that. What he said was that there were people who were impersonating soldiers to get veterans' benefits. There were, in fact, 61 cases being prosecuted at the time. That's what he was talking about. It's there for anyone to see. But the left undertook a completely dishonest campaign of personal destruction against him. Because they knew if they can stop Rush Limbaugh, they can destroy all of talk radio. And it was brutal, ladies and gentlemen. It was brutal. And at the end, he won. I won't go through how he won, but the ultimate humiliation, as only Rush can do. He took the letter of censorship used against him, and then the apology issued after Nancy Pelosi or somebody had to apologize. And he read it, and he told me, I'm gonna auction it on eBay. How do you think it'll do? And I'll match half of it. And I said, Rush, get ready. And he said, I put it up there, 30,000. It's 60,000. It's 90,000. It's 200,000. Ladies and gentlemen, by the time it ended, it was $2.3 million that was raised for veterans points, and he matched it. So it was complete humiliation. Did this stop the radicals? They came right back last year. Last year, they accused him of condoning sexual violence on college campuses. Now, stop for a second. Do you think for a moment Rush Limbaugh or anybody else in our movement would condone sexual violence on campuses? Well, they accused him of that. And what did they do? This time, they used a new technology. This time, they unleashed hundreds of thousands of tweets to the advertisers all over the country, just blasting them. You are underwriting, you are advertising on a show that condones sexual violence against women. How dare you? Get off that show immediately. Rush, being Rush, decided to do his own investigation. Came to find out it wasn't hundreds of thousands of people. It was 11. 11 people in their underwear, the underwear brigade, with very high-tech resources, projecting this vision that was never there. He stopped that as well when he unleashed them. Hollywood. What hypocrisy. What absolute hypocrisy. This is an industry that preaches tolerance at every opportunity. The radicals are running Hollywood now. The same thing is happening there. You dare question them and their dogma, and you will be destroyed. Ask David and Jason Benham, the Benham brothers. Good guys, very successful businessmen. They were given a show on HGTV. And then David Benham committed a cardinal mistake. He went on talk radio and he quoted Leviticus. For quoting Leviticus, the radicals unleashed a campaign on HGTV. You're giving a show to a hater and a bigot and a homophobe. They scared HGTV enough, the show was canceled. They tried doing the exact same thing with Phil Robertson, didn't they? They suspended him. It helps when you're the number one show on cable television and you've got gazillions of millions of supporters, because there was outrage over that. And in a very humiliated way, they had to put him back on. But that was their intention. How many of you are familiar with Friends of Abe? I go around the country. Now, you're weird people. You care about these things and you know about these things. If you go around the country, nobody knows who Friends of Abe is. If you do know, you know Gary Sinise, you know John Voight, you know Kelsey Grammer. But you don't know the dozens, the hundreds of other people who are associated with it. They don't dare come out of the woodwork for fear that the careers will be destroyed. How's that for freedom of speech? Academia. It's been documented how many times have conservatives been assaulted in schools all over the country. In 409 colleges and universities in America, 62% now have speech codes. 62% have got regulations regulating speech. And how do we see it? Just some examples. At Vanderbilt University, a Christian group's application for a club was deferred because it said in their bylaws that you had to be a Christian. At UNC Chapel Hill, a Christian group came under attack because it dismissed a member of its organization who was not a Christian. At the University of Mary Washington, the student paper, The Bullet, was forced to change its name because they were accused of propagating violence. At Drake University, hundreds of conservative newspapers were destroyed on campus. What had they done wrong? They had featured a pro-life ad. At the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, conservative newspapers were destroyed on the campus. When conservatives complained to the university did what a university in Massachusetts does. They banned the conservative newspaper. At the University of Miami Morris, a professor was encouraging students to destroy conservative papers. At Oregon State, they had to pay $101,000 in legal fees when it turned out the professors themselves were destroying conservative newspapers. At the University of California, Santa Barbara, if you've seen the video, there were two little high school girls with pro-life signs. They were accosted by this thug and her two associates. Their signs stolen, destroyed, taunted. They were charged, and they pleaded no contest. But that's what conservatives have to put up with on college campuses. Conservatives are living in fear on college campuses. Christianity itself is under assault by the radicals, where any exercise of your freedom of speech, if it does not conform with their dogma, means you will be destroyed. We've seen this case in Indiana. Folks, that's nothing. There are cases going on all over the country. The New Mexico Human Rights Commission levied a $6,600 fine against the owner, a photographer, because she declined to photograph a lesbian commitment ceremony. In Oregon, a Christian bakery run by Christians is facing a fine of up to $150,000 for refusing to bake a cake for a lesbian couple. In Idaho, 2 Christian ministers have been ordered by the state to perform same-sex marriages or to face jail time of up to 3 years and a fine of $1,000 a day for noncompliance. What do all these states, by the way, have in common? They're all conservative states. They're all culturally conservative states, and they're choosing them on purpose. In Houston, Texas, the lesbian mayor, outspoken radical, dispatched city's attorneys to churches throughout the state to demand that pastors surrender sermons of any kind, homilies of any kind, writings of any kind, where they talk about homosexuality or talk about her. Once again, it took Ted Cruz to come in and save the day and stop them. Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, Jeremiah Wright, these guys preach from the pulpit every single Sunday. And they preach politics. And we're told you're not supposed to do that. So some pastors last year got together and they said, we're going to have, and they called it Pulpit Freedom Sunday. And in Pulpit Freedom Sunday, we're all going to preach politics. What happened? The Freedom from Religion Foundation sued. Didn't sue them. Sued the IRS for not sufficiently prosecuting them. The IRS settled and has agreed to do a better job at it. How many people understand the fear that takes place? We've seen in recent days CBS News vilifying Tony Perkins and the Family Research Council as haters. And they used as their source the Southern Poverty Law Center that has labeled them as haters. CBS's audience doesn't know this because CBS won't tell them. The Southern Poverty Law Center has a hate map of Christian organizations in Washington. One of their supporters looked at that hate map and decided to do what he wanted to do, which was to walk into FRC's office, brandishing a pistol, and open fire. Grievously wounded Leo, the security guard, who still managed to disarm this guy. This guy was holding a bag of Chick-fil-A sandwiches and later testifies it was his intention to kill as many staff people as possible and lay a Chick-fil-A sandwich next to their heads, to each head, as a statement for what Chick-fil-A had done in supporting marriage. It's not just that, it's history. The radical left is now rewriting history. They're teaching in schools that George Washington was a radical, an extremist. Thomas Jefferson was a hypocrite. The Judeo-Christian tradition is not the cornerstone of American life. American exceptionalism is not a good thing. Ronald Reagan's tax cuts caused his deficits. This is just flatly untrue. What's even better, Ronald Reagan's policies on homosexuality caused AIDS. That's being taught in schools. Gorbachev is elevated in schools, while the communist threat is determined that it didn't exist. Strobe Talbot of Time magazine, later Clinton's ambassador to Russia, made the statement that Gorbachev is teaching the world that the communist threat isn't what it used to be, and even more, that it never was. That's the radical left's teaching on the subject. They ask these questions. This is Common Core. If a Palestinian suicide bomber kills several dozen Israeli teenagers in a Jerusalem restaurant, is that an act of terrorism or wartime retaliation against Israeli government policies? David Roberts writes for the radical left blog Grist. He said this about global warming. He said, when we finally gotten serious about global warming, we should have war crimes trials for those bastards. Some sort of climate Nuremberg. It's come to this. There's only one scientific position that's acceptable on climate debate. There's only one morally acceptable position on gay rights. Freedom is oppression. Free enterprise is confiscatory. Patriotism is un-American. Morality is immorality. And the Washington Redskins is hate speech. Censorship is everywhere. We can no longer support American exceptionalism. We can no longer trust God on our coins, pray to him in our schools, or even have a crucifix showing in a school when the president is speaking in front of it. Our beliefs are no longer insensitive, they are offensive. And what is offensive is hateful, and what is hateful should be criminalized. Do I exaggerate? A recent survey showed 51% of Democrats now support that. Webster defines fascism as a tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial control. Ladies and gentlemen, we're there. We are there. But we know we're there. The question is, what's our response? Is it to surrender to the fascists? Perhaps only gradually and certainly grudgingly, but surrender nonetheless. Is it to accept a new reality of a transformed society where freedom is an ever-distant memory? We have to ask ourselves this question. Is this your gift to your progeny? After millions of men and women shed their blood, and gave their lives to give you the freest society in the world. My God, that cannot be our response. But that has been our response to date. We have been in retreat since the days of Ronald Reagan, whether we care to admit it or not. It is time we turn around and face the enemy. It is time to turn around and ride to the sound of the guns. We should no longer tolerate this oppression. I want to be intolerant. We should no longer tolerate elected men and women in Congress who go along with this stealing of our fundamental right of free speech. We should no longer tolerate academia. Drain the swamp. Stop sending your children there. Stop giving them money. It's so easy. We should no longer tolerate the bigots. Call them bigots. Call them out. Call them anti-Christian bigots. That is what they are. And do it at every opportunity. Do not stop, and do not stop, and do not stop. We have our weapons that we didn't have before. Morton's mentioned what Leadership Institute has. So many organizations have ways of communicating with tens of millions of people. We didn't have this before. So communicate. Tell your story. Tell our story. Tell the American story. I promise the founders will be vindicated. Your progeny will be grateful. And I think the Almighty will be very happy. Thank you. Sure.
Brent will take some questions.
Sure.
Wow. In my youth, I recall that the ACLU was a great defender of the First Amendment. Suburb of Chicago in '68, Nazis wanted to have a parade, and the ACLU sent lawyers to secure that right to march, and I think they pointedly sent Jewish lawyers to defend the Nazis' right to peacefully march in Cicero. Where are our friends at the ACLU on all these issues?
What friends? Next. No, we don't have friends. We don't, I mean, look, I think it's in the ANA case. I think they're on the side of oppression against the right to religion. They're on the other side. I think it's in the ANA case that I just saw recently. No, the ACLU has its agenda. You know, it's like now. The National Organization of Women could care less about women. Every time a conservative woman is attacked, you'll never find them. Abortion, that's all they care about. So ACLU has its agenda, now has its agenda. Yes, sir. Are you going to name them?
In the context of the cultural war, would it be a violation of the Leadership Institute's 5013C situation if I were to mention that tomorrow night at the Luther Jackson School at 3020 Gallows Road, there will be an opportunity to talk about the Fairfax County's new gender confusion question, which apparently would have girls and boys taking showers together and some other stuff. That's 3020 Gallows Road tomorrow at 7.
See, this is interesting. Of course, the answer is, of course not. But maybe yes. This is something that it's free speech. But I can see it. I can see somebody taping this. And by the way, the taping business, George Soros, who has dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into this effort, set up an organization to monitor Catholic priests at the pulpit to make sure that they caught any priest saying anything that could be construed as political, where they are taping the sermons in the pews. So what has surprised me is a conspiracy talk to say somebody here could tape that and accuse you of political activism and come after the Leadership Institute. It doesn't surprise me for a second, not after the IRS.
Take your question down there.
Just very quickly, first of all, you know, the IRS is also trying to get involved in censoring speech before elections. They are proposing a rule to say that a 501c4, such as the organization I work for, we could lose or endanger our tax status if we sent out an email mentioning a candidate for office, which 60 days before an election, which means in October of an election year, we couldn't send out an email saying, call Don Beyer and tell him to vote against the budget deal or something like that. But my question is, do you think that in academia, the campus left is doing a disservice to students by sheltering them from opposing ideas, like with the recent incidents involving Christina Hoff Sommers, where the left-wing students were told, don't go see her. If you go see her, don't listen, shout her down because she's going to trigger you and she's going to give you bad feelings. And we want to protect the poor little darlings from opinions. And because when they get out into the real world and then they find out their PhDs in feminist studies will get them a nice job at Starbucks. They're not going to be able to build safe spaces there, whereas conservative and libertarian students will be used to intellectual combat, to having their ideas challenged in vicious ways, and so our team will be able to engage in real debate and in the real world, whereas their team will fall apart when they don't have their professors and administrators sheltering them from being exposed to opinions that they don't agree with.
Well, the shortcut answer on the IRS, how many people know that it's continuing? It never ended. This harassment is continuing. Organizations, there's one organization that has been 5 years and still hasn't gotten its determination letter with no explanation. So it's continuing. And where this 60-day before the election business is concerned, I am reminded that in the 1980s, the Sandinista communist regime instituted that in the elections in 1989. And we were horrified. The whole world was horrified. And we want to do it now in this country. College campuses are littered with the corpses of conservatives who went to speak and couldn't speak, or were violently attacked on college campuses. So much so that the Buckley Foundation now has launched its annual disinvitation dinner, where they're going to invite somebody who was disinvited to speak. George Will was the first one. So much for free speech. They will not. I spoke, and so many people have these stories. I spoke at Dartmouth one year when on the Gulf War, and I only spoke because one of their trustees, who happened to be one of our trustees, told Dartmouth he was going to cut off their funding, his funding to them, if they didn't bring me up, because they were talking about media bias in the war, and their debaters were the editor of Village Voice, the editor of the New York Times, and the head of the Ford Foundation. And so I went up there, and it was amazing because the moderator gave each one of them a very, very glowing introduction, and then told the audience not to believe me. Welcome to academia.
We often lament how academia is being used to indoctrinate our young people from schools up through colleges. I mean, it's great that we're starting to fight back on campuses. But
Excuse me, could you speak a little louder, please?
Oh, sorry. My apologies. We lament how the academia is indoctrinating our kids up to colleges. I mean, it's great we're fighting back on colleges, but even that's a little bit late. At the lower level, we were just literally, manna from heaven just fell down on us in Michelle Obama's school lunch program. I searched high and low for which Republicans or conservative groups were using this to punch back. Found almost nothing, but the only thing I could find was a small effort by the Alexandria Tea Party. I mean, this is a great opportunity to start deprogramming young people. The conservative media outlets have given some attention, but why aren't the Republicans and big conservative efforts using this and just overall taking the fight to them instead of fighting a defensive war?
Precisely my point. You want to come up here and speak? I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's my point. You know, why is it? My son is going into college this year, so I had to do the appropriate research. Go to the ISI listing of colleges where they go green light, yellow light, red light. It is about the most depressing thing you'll ever see, because they went to the nth degree to find green lights. And about 2/3 of the green lights were not green in my book. That tells you about the yellows and the reds. Catholic schools, you got 60-some million Catholics. I'm on the board of the Cardinal and Newman Society. We do our rating of Catholic schools. There are only 22 Catholic universities, colleges and universities, that we've given the green light to. I mean, so what has to happen? These people have to start fighting back. Instead of surrendering and retreating, compromise. Understand this about warfare. Compromise to us is giving up as little ground as possible. Compromise to the left is three things. One, taking things as far as they can, 2, having the ability to pick up and go further, and 3, always, always forward. Think about issue after issue after issue. They have never retreated backwards in 50 years. So we have to stop this compromise where we go and retreat. This is what happens on those college campuses. At the end of the day, we're just afraid to talk about Michelle. What the hell are we talking about? Of course we should go after Michelle. And this fascistic attitude of telling our children what they can and they can't eat.
Hi, Carl Golovin. I profess faith in Christ in the Reformed tradition, as do many within the Roman Catholic Church. And I wanted to share with you and ask if you've ever heard of a perspective that I think is very important in our country's history that has been long suppressed. The writings of Brigadier General Thomas Harris, who, 1897, he served on the military tribunal investigating Lincoln's assassination, wrote a book titled Rome's Responsibility in the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and actually traced, well, arguably goes back to the Reformation, the suppression of freedom of conscience and speech coming from the political hierarchy of the Roman Church. I know this is a very politically incorrect notion, but arguably the Counter-Reformation has never stopped. And I wonder if rather than Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, it's really a matter of papal authority versus reformed freedom of biblical belief and freedom of speech in the Western
Papal
tradition.
authority versus
Freedom of conscience. And while Rome has suppressed even reading of the Bible historically, of course.
Good Lord, no.
True. No.
Right.
Well, I highly recommend Brigadier General Harris's perspective.
Okay, but I would suggest there's a tinge of anti-Catholicism in your statement.
No, I profess faith in Christ, but the papacy has made war on the Reformed Church in history, of course.
No comment. That is, by the way, bigotry. No, it's bigotry.
I'd like to suggest, if possible, perhaps the prayer of 1774 be read again, maybe at the end of this. Because, Brent, you've painted the gravity of the situation, to me, and my understanding of history is just as intense as in the 1700s for our people. And again, just like in those times, we are the remnant, the small, who think freedom and future and posterity as they did. They were a small group, were they not? And I guess the bottom line for us conservatives is if we don't stop this, no one will.
Well, here's some very positive news in all this. America's on our side. On issue after issue after issue. We have lost dramatic ground on gay rights. But we've lost it, and we need to follow and see why we lost that ground. Look what the left did, the cultural left did. It was brilliant. And in retrospect, it was so easy. 20 years ago, it was unimaginable that we would be where we are right now. Unimaginable. Even 10 years ago, it was unimaginable. What happened? It began in the 1980s. The GLAAD organization did something very, very smart. They went to their allies in Hollywood, and they got an agreement where one of their representatives was allowed to be on each show in production on nighttime television to make sure that the politically correct position on gays and gay rights, as they saw it, was being portrayed. And that's how you started seeing, bit by bit by bit by bit, more and more and more gays. And who watches it? Young people. And unfortunately, conservatives. I had the Parents Television Council, and I will tell you, it was very frustrating trying to get conservatives to look at the culture. Now, I don't watch television. Who cares? Let me tell you, more people watch reruns of The Simpsons than watch CBS Evening News. So the cultural left understood this. And they went in there. Then they went in with movies. Then they went in with academia. And what they did was to change an entire generation's thinking of young people. And what they understand is that politics is the end of the cultural war. It is the end game of the culture. And so they changed the culture, and politics followed. We focus on politics all the time. This is what I'm trying to say. We need to go into culture. This is why we need to go into storytelling. But remember, America's on our side. So let's not be depressed about this.
Last question, lady in the back.
I apologize for being late. I saw you at the Lincoln Ball, so I know a little bit about your message. My question is this. Do you believe that the apathy you're speaking of among the American people is because they're not aware of really what's going on, like among the young generation and among much of America? Or do you think it's because our society and our culture has changed so much that those things are now acceptable to the majority of the people?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, on the gay issue, it's acceptable. Take abortion. Abortion is going in our direction. If only we would figure it out. That pain-capable bill, the 20-week abortion bill, this gives an opening to get pro-choicers on our side. Because when pro-choicers became pro-choice, they didn't know this. And how many pro-choicers are in favor of allowing a child's body to be dismembered where the child is feeling the dismemberment? So there can be an effort made to bring them. What did Republicans do? They ran from it. It's an amazing proposition. So some things have been accepted. Some things are very much on our side. I'll point out, is there a single thing that I talked about today that you've seen on the news? A single thing I've talked about, and this is my point. This is by the bias of omission, where they're simply not reporting it. The beauty is if you go on the internet, these things are now starting to be discussed everywhere. And there are an awful lot more people going on the internet than going on national television. One thing that I'll leave you with, and I told Morton this, 51% of all video content is now on your phone. 51% of everything that is watched is now on your phone. The question is, how many of us are using the phone for our video content? We have to go with the technology and tell our story. I really think we're going to be fine. Thank you.
Brent, thank you very much. We really appreciate your coming. You are a superb speaker, and we are delighted that you are heading a very powerful organization that you have built. As a token of our appreciation, let me present to you an Adam Smith tie.